When Hitler's tanks crossed the Polish border at dawn on September 1st, 1939, Europe seemed to hold its breath, disbelieving that the nightmare had returned. For 20 years, the world had lived in the fragile shadow of peace. The Great War had promised to be the war to end all wars. But, as German panzers rolled through the mist of a Polish morning, the illusion shattered. The thunder of engines and artillery was not merely the sound of invasion, it was the sound of history breaking open again. The first strike. At 4:45 a.m., the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on the Polish garrison at Westerplatte. Within hours, armored columns were pouring across the border from 3 directions. Above them, the Luftwaffe owned the skies, its Stuka dive bombers howling as they descended, their sirens engineered to terrify. Villages were erased in minutes. Roads clogged with fleeing civilians became targets themselves. The Polish army, brave but outdated, fought back with the spirit of a nation that had risen from partition and oppression. But courage could not stop the lightning. German forces moved with a speed and coordination the world had never seen. Tanks, aircraft, and motorized infantry worked as one, striking deep, fast, and without pause. This was blitzkrieg, lightning war, the ruthless marriage of technology, planning, and surprise. In less than 3 weeks, Poland's fate was sealed. Europe holds its breath. In London and Paris, the news stunned leaders who had spent the last years trying, and failing, to appease Hitler's ambitions. On September 3rd, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The world was at war again. Yet even as those words echoed through Parliament and the airwaves, a strange paralysis gripped the West. There were no great offensives, no marching armies across the Rhine. For the people of Poland, those promises of alliance remained only words carried by the wind. Historians would call it the phony war, la drôle de guerre, die Sitzkrieg. On paper, Europe was engulfed in total war. In reality, along the Western Front, soldiers stared across barbed wire at an enemy that did not move. Weeks passed, then months. Winter, Britain began to mobilize, training new divisions, rationing supplies, preparing for the storm they knew was coming. In Paris, people queued for coffee as if nothing had changed, while in Warsaw, entire districts lay in ruin. The contrast was haunting. The East was burning. The West, waiting. A nation divided. On September 17th, another shadow fell across Poland. From the east came the Red Army, bound by a secret pact with Hitler, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Stalin's forces invaded, dividing the country between 2 totalitarian empires. There would be no help from Moscow, no salvation from the Allies. Poland was consumed, crushed in the jaws of history. Its leaders fled to exile, its soldiers scattered or captured. Thousands were deported to Siberia. Thousands more would die in the forests of Katyn. The world watched, horrified, but helpless. For Germany, it was a triumph, swift, decisive, and total. The experiment of blitzkrieg had worked, and it had changed the rules of war forever. The calm before the tempest. While the Wehrmacht celebrated victory, Europe drifted into uneasy silence. Newspapers in Britain filled their front pages with speculation and dread. Was Hitler satisfied now that Poland had fallen? Or was this only the beginning? In Berlin, the answer was already taking shape. The Führer's gaze turned west, toward Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, and France. The same machine that had crushed Poland was being sharpened for its next strike. Meanwhile, Along the Maginot Line, France's vast network of fortresses and tunnels, soldiers sat idle, smoking, playing cards, listening to the wireless. They called it the drôle de guerre, the strange war. Bombers droned high above, but rarely dropped their loads. To many, it felt like waiting for a storm that might never come. Yet, deep down, everyone knew. It was only a matter of time. The psychology of shock. For the people of Europe, 1939 was not merely the return of conflict. It was the collapse of everything they thought they understood about war. The old world, of trench lines, slow mobilizations, and distant fronts, had vanished overnight. In its place came a new kind of horror. Total, fast, mechanical. The Blitzkrieg was not just a military doctrine. It was psychological warfare. Its essence was shock. The enemy was to be broken before it could think, overwhelmed before it could organize. Cities were not simply conquered. They were made to feel the futility of resistance. The message was clear. The Reich could strike anywhere, anytime, with unstoppable force. Echoes of the Great War, for Britain and France, the trauma of 1914 still lingered. Millions had died in the mud of Flanders and the Somme. The memory of that bloodletting haunted every decision. No leader wanted to repeat it. And so, the Western powers hesitated, paralyzed by the ghosts of the past. Their people still rebuilding, their hearts still grieving. They hoped against reason that perhaps, somehow, this war might still be contained. But Hitler understood that hesitation. He fed on it. While the West waited, he rearmed. While diplomats debated, he planned the next strike, the new face of war. As autumn turned to winter, Poland was erased from the map. Nazi and Soviet officials met to divide its lands, their soldiers posing for photographs as if celebrating a grim alliance. Refugees streamed westward, stories of massacre and ruin following them like shadows. In the occupied cities, a new order was imposed, one built on fear, propaganda, and obedience. For many Poles, the war did not end with defeat. It had only begun, underground, in secret, in whispers of resistance that would smolder for years. For Europe, the message was unmistakable. The age of Blitzkrieg had arrived, and it would not stop in Poland. The world watches. Across the oceans, in Washington, President Roosevelt addressed a nation still clinging to neutrality. "This nation will remain a neutral nation," he said, but his tone carried a note of unease. America watched as Europe burned, uncertain how long distance could protect it. In Tokyo, the rising sun of Japan watched too, taking lessons from the German Lightning War, imagining how such tactics might shape its own empire in Asia. The fuse of global war had been lit. Epilogue. The gathering storm. By the spring of 1940, the waiting was over. The German war machine turned westward, and what had begun in Poland would soon engulf Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and finally France itself. The world would learn in fire and ruin what Blitzkrieg truly meant. But in those first months, as the fires of Warsaw faded and the snows of winter fell on Europe, there remained a fragile illusion that the storm might somehow pass. It would not. The time of Blitzkrieg had only just begun. Chapter 2. The Fall of France. In the spring of 1940, the world watched in disbelief as France, the proud heart of Europe, the nation that had once stood against empires, fell in a matter of weeks. The German Blitzkrieg had already devoured Poland. But what happened next would astonish even its architects. No one, not even Hitler, could have imagined how swiftly one of the greatest armies on earth would collapse. The calm before the storm. For 7 long months after Poland's destruction, Europe existed in uneasy limbo, a strange stillness that the French called la drôle de guerre, the funny war. Along the Maginot Line, soldiers lounged in underground fortresses, confident that the massive wall of concrete and steel would protect them. Newspapers joked that the only casualties so far were boredom and bad wine. But behind the scenes, the storm was gathering. On May 10, 1940, at dawn, the Blitzkrieg struck again. This time it came not from the east, but through the quiet forests and winding roads of Belgium and the Ardennes, a region the French believed impassable for tanks. They were wrong. The lightning unleashed. Columns of German armor poured through the trees like a river of steel. At their head rode General Heinz Guderian's panzers, moving with terrifying precision. They did not stop to fight. They flowed, bypassed, encircled, outflanked. The Luftwaffe screamed overhead, shattering roads, bridges, and morale. French command centers fell into chaos. Communication lines broke down. Orders contradicted each other. What had begun as a confident defense turned into a desperate scramble for survival. In just 4 days, the German army advanced deeper into France than the Allies had imagined possible in months. The collapse of certainty. The Allied plan, the Dial Plan, had expected the main German thrust to come through central Belgium, just as in 1914. French and British divisions rushed north to meet that phantom enemy, leaving the heart of France dangerously exposed. Then came the breakthrough at Sedan, the point where everything changed. The Maginot Line was bypassed. The German spearhead tore through French defenses and raced westward toward the English Channel. By mid-May, the French High Command realized the unthinkable. Their army was being cut in two. The race to the sea. The panzers drove relentlessly, reaching the coast near Abbeville on May 20th. In less than 2 weeks, the German army had trapped the British Expeditionary Force and hundreds of thousands of French and Belgian troops against the sea. The encircled soldiers faced annihilation. The only way out, across the Channel. Dunkirk. We were surrounded, cut off. The sky was black with smoke. We thought it was the end. These are the words of Private James McAllister of the Royal Warwickshire Regiment, one of the men stranded on the beaches of Dunkirk. Here, amid chaos and despair, something extraordinary happened. As German guns thundered closer, an improvised armada took shape. Warships, fishing trawlers, pleasure yachts, ferries, anything that could float. From ports all along the English coast, they sailed into hell. For 9 days, from May 26th to June 4th, under constant air attack, they carried men home. The sea was rough. The beaches were choked with smoke, burning vehicles, and wounded men calling for help. Yet the evacuation went on, hour after hour, night after night. By the time it ended, more than 338,000 soldiers had been rescued. Winston Churchill would call it a miracle of deliverance. And yet, as he reminded Parliament, wars are not won by evacuations. The fall of Paris. While the last ships left Dunkirk, the German army resumed its advance. With the northern front shattered, France was defenseless. On June 10th, the government fled Paris. The capital, once the beating heart of European civilization, stood silent. 2 days later, German troops entered the city. They marched down the Champs-Élysées, their boots echoing on the cobblestones as if time itself had been conquered. A few mornings later, Adolf Hitler arrived. He stood before the Eiffel Tower, hands clasped behind his back, the world's most famous landmark framed behind him. Cameras clicked. For the Führer, it was a moment of destiny, the ultimate symbol of vengeance for the humiliation of 1918. In just 6 weeks, France, which had fought for 4 years in the Great War, was gone. The armistice. On June 22, 1940, in a forest clearing near Compiègne, France signed an armistice with Germany. The location was no coincidence. It was the very same railway carriage where Germany had surrendered to the Allies in 1918. Now, Hitler stood in the same spot, silent, triumphant, as the roles were reversed. The message could not have been clearer. The age of revenge had come. France was divided. The North fell under German occupation. The South became the so-called Vichy regime, a puppet government under Marshal Pétain. The map of Europe was redrawn once again, and the dream of a quick Allied victory lay in ruins. The psychological shock. The fall of France sent shockwaves through the world. For Britain, it was a nightmare made real. The ally on whom it had relied for strength was gone. Europe now lay at Hitler's feet. In London, Churchill spoke to a nation in disbelief. "The Battle of France is over," he said. "I expect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin." Across the Atlantic, in the still neutral United States, people stared at newspapers in stunned silence. France, France, the birthplace of liberty and revolution, had been conquered in 46 days. If such a nation could fall, who could stand against the Nazi war machine? The psychological impact was immense. German propaganda portrayed Hitler as invincible, his armies as unstoppable. Even within the Wehrmacht, there was a sense of awe. Generals who had doubted the speed of the offensive now believed they were witnessing a new era of warfare. The Blitzkrieg was no longer theory. It was legend. Echoes on the shore. Yet in the midst of defeat, a strange kind of hope survived. On the beaches of Dunkirk, men who had lost everything, their weapons, their comrades, their homeland, returned to England alive. Exhausted, humiliated, but unbroken. Some would go on to fight again in North Africa, in Italy, in Normandy. Many would never forget the sight of Dunkirk, the smell of oil and smoke, the cries for help, the feeling that somehow, against all odds, they had been spared for something greater. A continent in chains. By the summer of 1940, Europe was under German control. From the Arctic Circle to the Pyrenees, from the Atlantic to the gates of Moscow, only Britain stood free. Hitler believed the war was nearly won. But across the Channel, the island fortress was preparing to resist. The fall of France marked not the end, but the beginning of a new phase of the conflict. One that would test not just armies, but the very endurance of nations. Chapter 3. The Battle of Britain. "The Battle of France is over," Winston Churchill declared. "I expect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin." In the summer of 1940, Europe lay in darkness. From the Arctic to the Pyrenees, from Warsaw to Paris, the swastika flew over conquered lands. Only Britain remained, isolated, defiant, standing alone. For Hitler, the war in the West seemed all but won. The French army had fallen, the British expeditionary force had fled, and the Wehrmacht now ruled the continent. Only one obstacle remained between Germany and total domination of Europe: the island fortress across the Channel. The Battle of Britain would decide the fate of nations. The shadow of invasion. Operation Seelöwe, Sea Lion, was Hitler's plan to invade the British Isles. But before a single German soldier could set foot on English soil, the Luftwaffe had to destroy the Royal Air Force. Control of the skies was everything. Without it, any invasion fleet would be torn apart by British bombers and the Royal Navy before it could reach the beaches. And so, in July 1940, the greatest air battle in history began. The few. The RAF was hopelessly outnumbered. Fewer planes, fewer pilots, fewer resources. The Luftwaffe could send over 2,000 aircraft. Britain had barely half that number. Yet, what the British lacked in quantity, they made up for in will. Their pilots were young, many barely out of school. They flew Hurricanes and Spitfires, fast, elegant machines that would soon become symbols of defiance. They came from across the Commonwealth, Canadians, New Zealanders, Australians, and from occupied nations, Poles, Czechs, Frenchmen, who refused to stop fighting even when their own countries had fallen. They called themselves simply the few. As Churchill would later say, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." The first attacks. The German campaign began with probing raids on shipping in the Channel. Then the strikes deepened. Radar stations, airfields, and fighter bases. The Luftwaffe believed it could crush the RAF in weeks. But Britain had a secret weapon, something the Germans underestimated: radar. Along the southern coast, a chain of tall, skeletal towers stood watch over the Channel. They formed the world's first integrated air defense system, codenamed Chain Home. Linked to operations rooms by telephone, these stations could detect incoming aircraft while they were still over France. Within minutes, squadrons could be scrambled to intercept. This was the birth of modern air warfare, where science and courage met. The war in the sky. From July to October, the skies over Britain became a battlefield. Day after day, waves of German bombers crossed the Channel, escorted by Messerschmitt fighters. RAF pilots climbed to meet them, often outnumbered, sometimes out of fuel, always out of time. The dogfights were fierce, chaotic, and terrifying. Engines roared, machine guns chattered, trails of smoke crisscrossed the sky. Many pilots never returned. Those who did often landed with bullet holes in their wings or in their arms. For the men of fighter command, life expectancy was measured in weeks. Yet morale held. When planes were destroyed, ground crews worked through the night to repair them. When pilots were lost, others stepped forward to take their place. In control, bunkers across southern England, women of the WAF, the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, plotted enemy movements on great glass maps, coordinating the defense minute by minute. This was total war, fought not only by soldiers, but by an entire nation. The Blitz begins. By late August, the Luftwaffe was frustrated. Despite constant bombardment, the RAF refused to break. British radar and communication networks continued to function. Morale remained unshaken. Then, on the night of August 24th, a group of German bombers accidentally dropped their bombs on London. In retaliation, Churchill ordered an attack on Berlin. The damage to the German capital was slight, but the psychological blow was enormous. Enraged, Hitler changed strategy. The Luftwaffe shifted its focus from airfields to cities. The Blitz had begun. Night after night, bombers rained fire on London, Coventry, Liverpool, and dozens of other towns. Streets burned, cathedrals collapsed, thousands died. Yet the British spirit, that stubborn refusal to yield, only hardened. In the underground stations, families huddled through the night, singing, sharing tea, reading newspapers by candlelight. Above them, the city burned, but it endured. Churchill visited the ruins himself, walking among the rubble, hat in hand. He refused to flinch, even as bombs fell nearby. "We shall never surrender," he had promised, and the people believed him. Turning the tide. The shift in German strategy proved fatal. By abandoning the systematic destruction of RAF bases, the Luftwaffe gave Fighter Command the breathing space it needed. Airfields were repaired, new planes rolled off production lines, and the radar network continued to warn of every attack. On September 15, 1940, the Luftwaffe launched its largest assault yet, over 1,000 aircraft sent to crush London once and for all. The British response was immediate and decisive. Wave after wave of German bombers were intercepted. The sky over the capital became a storm of vapor trails and explosions. By day's end, nearly 60 German planes had been shot down. The invasion of Britain was postponed, then quietly abandoned. The impossible had happened. Germany had been stopped. The price of victory. Victory came at a terrible cost. More than 1,000 RAF pilots were killed, many of them barely 20 years old. Entire squadrons were wiped out. London was scarred, cities in ruins. But Britain still stood. For the first time in the war, the seemingly invincible German war machine had been defeated. The psychological effect was immense. Across the free world, people looked to the island nation and saw not weakness, but hope. Churchill's voice carried across the airwaves, rough, defiant, unyielding. "Hitler knows he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be free. The whole world will move forward into broad, sunlit uplands, a people's war." The Battle of Britain was not fought by soldiers alone. It was fought by factory workers building Spitfires at breakneck speed, by farmers feeding a blockaded nation, by mothers and children sleeping underground as bombs fell above. It was fought by the volunteers of the Home Guard, by firefighters battling infernos, by doctors tending the wounded through the night. And it was fought by a leader who refused to despair. Winston Churchill understood that victory began not in weapons, but in spirit. "If the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years," he said, "men will still say, 'This was their finest hour.'" Epilogue. The Few and the Future. By October 1940, the Luftwaffe began to withdraw. The invasion that had seemed certain never came. Britain was bloodied, blackened, but unbroken. In the skies, the young men of the RAF had turned the tide of history. Their courage bought the time the Allies would need to regroup, rearm, and one day return to liberate Europe. The Battle of Britain was not just a victory of arms, it was a victory of will. It proved that tyranny could be resisted, that courage could triumph over fear. As autumn fell over England and the bombers drifted away into the night, the world glimpsed, for the first time, the beginning of hope. "Never in the field of human conflict," Churchill said, "was so much owed by so many to so few." The few had saved not only Britain, but the very idea of freedom itself. Chapter 4. New Theaters and Secret Pacts. As Europe smoldered under Nazi domination, new fires began to spread across the globe. The Second World War was no longer a continental conflict. It was becoming a war of worlds. By early 1941, Hitler's armies stood victorious from the North Sea to the Black Sea. France had fallen, Scandinavia was under occupation, and Britain stood alone, bruised, defiant, but still in the fight. Yet the war was far from over. It was only changing shape. The Desert War begins. In the spring of 1941, the eyes of the world turned south, to the blazing sands of North Africa. There, amid dunes and endless horizons, two empires collided. Britain, clinging to its last strategic footholds, and Italy, desperate to prove itself as a great power. Benito Mussolini had dreamed of a new Roman Empire. From Libya, his troops invaded Egypt in late 1940, but the campaign collapsed almost instantly. The British struck back, driving deep into Libya and capturing tens of thousands of Italian soldiers. Humiliated, Mussolini appealed to Hitler for help. The German answer came in February 1941, when a new commander arrived in Tripoli, a man whose name would soon echo across the desert: Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. Rommel was no ordinary general. Daring, charismatic, and ruthless, he was a master of mobile warfare, a commander who lived at the front, moving with the dust and roar of his tanks. His Afrika Korps, a relatively small force of seasoned German troops, transformed the desert into a chessboard of fire and steel. The desert was vast, featureless, merciless. Temperatures soared by day and plunged by night. Engines overheated, sand clogged every weapon, and mirages danced on the horizon. But for Rommel, the landscape was freedom, a place where speed and deception could decide the outcome of battle. He struck fast and unexpectedly, turning apparent retreat into ambush, luring the British into traps, and earning the nickname the Desert Fox. In a matter of weeks, his forces swept back across Libya, recapturing key positions and pushing the British toward Egypt. For the first time since France's fall, the Nazi war machine had found a new stage and a new legend: the battle for the Mediterranean. Control of North Africa meant control of the Mediterranean, the vital lifeline of the British Empire. Convoys from India, Australia, and the Middle East passed through these waters. Malta, a tiny island fortress, became a dagger pointed at the Axis supply lines. Bombed relentlessly, its defenders held on, turning back attack after attack. In Cairo and Alexandria, British intelligence and codebreakers worked to anticipate Rommel's every move. They read his supply reports, tracked his convoys, and played a deadly game of cat and mouse across the sea. But in 1941, the outcome was far from clear. Every mile gained or lost in the desert could alter the course of the war. The Balkans, Hitler's southern gamble. While Rommel's tanks roared through the dunes, Hitler's attention turned eastward to the unstable patchwork of nations in the Balkans. Yugoslavia, Greece, and Bulgaria were torn between Axis pressure and Allied promises. The region was a powder keg of politics, nationalism, and revenge. In March 1941, Yugoslavia reluctantly joined the Axis, only for its government to be overthrown in a pro-British coup days later. Enraged, Hitler ordered an invasion. On April 6th, German forces swept into Yugoslavia and Greece. In a matter of weeks, both countries were crushed. Athens fell on April 27th. Greek soldiers fought bravely alongside British and Commonwealth troops, but they were hopelessly outmatched. The ancient land that had once given the world the idea of freedom was now under the shadow of the swastika. Yet the occupation of the Balkans would come at a cost Hitler did not anticipate. The campaign delayed his greatest plan, one that would soon reshape the entire war. The Pact of Shadows. 2 years earlier, in August 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union had shocked the world by signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a so-called non-aggression treaty. To the public, it appeared to guarantee peace between the two ideologically opposed powers. But hidden within its secret protocol was a cynical bargain: the division of Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Poland would be carved in two. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, would fall under Soviet control, and Stalin would be free to expand into Finland and Bessarabia, while Hitler devoured the West. It was a marriage of convenience between two dictators who despised each other, a temporary pact between wolves. In the months that followed, the arrangement seemed to work. Germany fed on the industrial riches of occupied Europe, while the Soviet Union annexed new territories under the guise of liberation. Trains crossed the borders carrying Soviet grain and oil to the Reich, essential supplies that kept Hitler's war machine alive. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. The breaking point. By 1941, Hitler's ambitions had outgrown the pact. He no longer saw Stalin as a partner, but as prey. In private meetings, he spoke of Lebensraum, living space, and the need to conquer the Soviet lands to secure food, oil, and raw materials. He called it the final crusade against Bolshevism. German generals began to notice strange movements on the eastern frontier: reconnaissance flights, new maps being printed, supplies quietly stockpiled. The code name for the coming invasion was Operation Barbarossa. At the same time, Stalin remained convinced that Hitler would not dare attack while Britain still stood defiant. His own intelligence warned him again and again, but he refused to believe it. As spring turned to summer, the two empires smiled across their shared border, exchanging diplomats, signing trade deals, even as their armies prepared for war. The world divides. By mid-1941, the conflict had spread to every corner of the globe. In Africa, Rommel and the British clashed beneath a sun that turned metal to fire. In the Balkans, German troops marched through ancient cities draped in swastikas, and across the plains of Eastern Europe, a storm was gathering, silent, unseen, inevitable. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, once a cynical masterpiece of diplomacy, was now a death sentence waiting to be signed. When it broke, it would unleash a war of annihilation unlike anything the world had ever seen. Epilogue: The calm before Barbarossa. In June 1941, the sands of the desert shimmered with heat. British convoys sailed under constant attack. German soldiers rested in occupied Athens, unaware of what was coming next. And far to the east, along a 1,000-mile frontier, more than 3 million German troops were quietly assembling. For now, the secret pact still held. Two dictators pretending to be allies. But the countdown had already begun. Within weeks, the illusion would shatter. The wolves would turn on each other, and the Second World War would enter its most terrible chapter. The world had entered an age where alliances meant nothing, and betrayal was only a matter of time. Chapter 5: Operation Barbarossa, the War of Annihilation. It was the dawn of June 22, 1941. The sun rose over the forests, rivers, and endless plains of Eastern Europe, and with it came the roar of engines, the thunder of artillery, and the breaking of a pact born in deceit. At 4 a.m, without a declaration of war, 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border. From the Baltic to the Black Sea, 1,000 miles of fire lit the horizon. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, had begun. It would become the largest and bloodiest military campaign in human history. The betrayal. For nearly 2 years, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union had lived under a fragile peace, bound by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. They had divided Eastern Europe, traded resources, and pretended to respect each other's sovereignty. But behind the smiles and signatures, Hitler had always planned to destroy the Soviet Union. To him, the East was a vast, untamed wilderness, land to be conquered, its people to be enslaved or exterminated. He called it the struggle for Lebensraum, living space for the German race. Now, His dream of empire was turning into a campaign of annihilation. As the first shells exploded over the border towns of Brest and Grodno, Stalin refused to believe the truth. For hours, Soviet commanders were forbidden to return fire. The Red Army was caught unprepared, its planes destroyed on the ground, its divisions encircled by lightning-fast German panzer assaults. By evening, the Wehrmacht had advanced nearly 50 miles. The world's largest nation was in shock. The storm unleashed. In the first weeks of the invasion, victory seemed certain for Germany. Columns of Soviet prisoners, weary, dust-covered, and stunned, marched west by the hundreds of thousands. German radio declared the Red Army destroyed. Propaganda posters showed Hitler as a new Napoleon, leading civilization against barbarism. But the reality on the ground was far darker. The Eastern Front was not just a war between armies. It was a war against people. Villages were burned, entire populations executed. Behind the front lines followed the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads whose orders were clear: to eliminate Jews, communists, and anyone deemed undesirable. What began as an invasion quickly became a campaign of extermination. Voices from the front. Diary of Gefreiter Hans Müller, 18th Panzer Division, July 1941. We have marched for days. The roads are dust and smoke. Prisoners everywhere, faces like ghosts. I thought this would be like France, quick, clean. But here, everything burns. Even the air smells of death. Letter from Private Sergei Ivanov, 5th Rifle Corps, July 1941. They came before dawn. Planes, tanks, endless columns. We had no orders, no time. My friend Misha was hit near the border. We buried him in the wheat field. They told us to fall back, but there is nowhere to go. The Eastern Front devoured men and machines alike. Temperatures soared in summer, and roads turned to rivers of mud with the autumn rains. German tanks bogged down, Soviet reinforcements arrived by rail, and the front stretched into infinity. The Siege of Leningrad. Far to the north, the ancient city of Leningrad, cradle of the revolution, found itself encircled. By September, German and Finnish forces had cut off every road, every railway, every line of supply. What followed was one of the longest and most brutal sieges in human history. For 872 days, the city endured hunger, shelling, and unimaginable cold. Civilians ate wallpaper paste, sawdust bread, even glue. Entire families froze in their apartments, yet the city refused to surrender. Diary of Tanya Savicheva, age 11. Zhenya died on December 28th. Grandma died on January 25th. Leka died on March 17th. All have died. Only Tanya is left. Her small notebook would later be found by Soviet troops, a child's testament to the suffering of a city that never yielded. Throughout the siege, a narrow route across the frozen Lake Ladoga, known as the Road of Life, became the city's only link to the outside world. Trucks carried bread in and refugees out under constant bombardment. Many never made it across. By the end of the siege, over 1 million civilians were dead. Yet Leningrad still stood. The push to Moscow. As the leaves turned red in October 1941, Hitler launched Operation Typhoon, the final drive toward Moscow. The German High Command believed one last offensive could finish the Soviet Union before winter. The Wehrmacht advanced through forests and fields, encircling cities like Vyazma and Bryansk, capturing hundreds of thousands more Soviet soldiers. German officers were confident. They sent telegrams home. Victory by Christmas. But the Soviet capital was no ordinary city. It was the heart of a nation, a symbol of survival. As German forces approached within sight of its outer suburbs, Stalin refused to leave. He ordered the factories to dismantle machinery and move it east beyond the Urals. Thousands of workers, women, and even teenagers took up arms. The streets were fortified, the subways became shelters. And then, the winter came. The winter that stopped the world. By November, temperatures plunged below 30 degrees Celsius. Engines froze, oil congealed, rifles jammed. German soldiers, dressed in light uniforms meant for summer, wrapped themselves in curtains and stolen blankets. The same roads that had carried them eastward now became fields of ice and snow. Diary of Oberleutnant Karl Fischer, near Klin, December 1941. The cold is like a living thing. Men fall asleep and never wake up. We burn furniture for warmth. Moscow is so close. We can see the glow of the city at night. But it might as well be the moon. Then, in early December, the Red Army struck back. Siberian divisions, battle-hardened troops withdrawn from the Far East, counterattacked under the command of General Zhukov. Using skis, camouflage, and the advantage of winter, they drove the Germans back from the gates of Moscow. For the first time, Hitler's army retreated. The myth of invincibility was broken. The turning of the tide. By the end of 1941, the invasion that was supposed to last 3 months had turned into a war of endurance. Both sides had suffered catastrophic losses. Millions dead, wounded, or missing. Entire towns vanished from the map. The Eastern Front stretched for 2,000 miles, a scar across the face of Europe. The German dream of swift conquest was gone. Instead, Hitler faced a nightmare of his own making, a war he could neither end nor control. And for the Soviet Union, the struggle had become existential, not just for land or ideology, but for survival itself. The human cost. In the ruins of villages and on the frozen fields, soldiers on both sides began to understand the true nature of the war they were fighting. Letter from Soviet nurse Anna Petrova, December 1941. We carry the wounded from the snow. Some have no fingers left. We pour hot water on their boots to free them from ice. I used to be afraid of death. Now I am only afraid of forgetting. The war on the Eastern Front was not just about strategy or borders. It was about humanity itself. Every victory came with a price written in blood. The year of endless night. By the spring of 1942, the snows began to melt, revealing the devastation beneath. Villages were ash, forests filled with graves. Yet both armies were preparing to fight again. The Soviet Union had survived, barely. The German Reich had failed to deliver its promised victory. And between them lay a front that would consume tens of millions more lives before it was over. The betrayal of June 1941 had unleashed forces that could no longer be contained. What began as a campaign for conquest had become a struggle for the soul of Europe. Operation Barbarossa was not just a military operation. It was a descent into darkness, a war of ideology, of vengeance, of survival, a war that turned soldiers into ghosts and nations into graves.